It's a pleasure to be with you. Hello for everybody. Good morning. And it is a pleasure to be with you. And the first time we will see Cioran's thought in the context of the real, a study of the void as a pharmacon for the real. This search is from Mizuki Kaneta. He is doing his study in Hiroshima University. Now, you have your time to present your search. Be welcome.
Thank you for your introduction. So, hello, I'm Mizuki Kaneta, a PhD student in Hiroshima University, Japan. My main research area is French philosophy. Today, I do not have any slides, but I hope my presentation piques your curiosity. I'm going to talk about one of my research topics that concerns Emile Cioran, a Romanian-born French philosopher. And my study puts his philosophy in the context of the real that has been itself an intriguing subject matter in continental thoughts and French philosophy. So, for continental thoughts and theories, the real has been a daunting concept or a non concept that resists being appropriated, and it is especially problematic when it comes to the difficulty of agreeing on what it is. But it is evoked in numerous texts as the thing that always remains as an impassive thought and formalization, or the thing that requires a different approach to and from the real itself. In terms of anthropocentrism and what Meillassoux calls correlationism, the real's indifference to our thoughts and ideas has been a crucial issue, and the affiliation of different philosophies to idealism and even to the idealism and realism diet itself has been re-examined. As Ian James writes, French thinkers seek in various ways to move beyond the anti-foundationalist or deconstructing moment, and do so in the name of what might be called the groundless or non-foundational ground of the real, conceived variously as givenness, sense, technicity, plasticity, the sensible, the multiple, or the one. End of quote. I do not intend here to count how many texts have mentioned this puzzling thing, or to analyze how they discuss the real, but I would like to assume the severity of the inundation of semblances and appearances in our everyday life as that which coincides our interest in the real. Nietzsche is one of the anti-realist, anti-Platonist philosophers who combine the real and the fictional. As Francois Laruelle writes, the real is a fabrication or a representation, but furthermore, fiction is as real as it can be. It suffices that it wills itself as such. Fiction represents the real for another fiction, the real represents fiction for another real. The Nietzschean way of saying that the real is fictional and the fictional real. It would not be too outlandish to claim today that we, in our network-centric life, often experience and suffer from this fusion between the real and the fictional, almost to the point where nothing appears real anymore. Ideas of, for instance, John Baudrillard as an interpreter of Nietzsche, such as the disappearance of the real, may sound too familiar and mundane to us today. So why is Cioran important? His order of thought oscillates, I argue, between an Nietzschean nihilism, or what he calls an automatism of doubt, and the fatalism of birth. His nihilism escapes both the Nietzschean dogma of vitality and the pessimistic reification of death. This means, on the one hand, that Cioran's philosophy is about withdrawing from the world of the fictional real, representation and interpretation. Cioran's program, if there was one, is neither to make conclusive remarks about being nor to search for the value of life. On the other hand, his preoccupation with life and birth indicates that the fatedness of having been real him. One of the consequences of this facing this impasse is his paradoxical desire for stillbirth and the passion for the void. I will try to associate the concept, or the known concept of stillbirth, with his understanding of the void, apropos the real of life. The relationship between the real and the void appears to be a very crucial topic when it comes to our approach to and from the real. The question here is whether the void is a pharmakon, a remedy and a poison that palliates and contaminates the real. So the problem of Nietzscheanism, to begin with, is that the unity of the real and the fictional is replaced by the multiplicity of the fictional real. If the relationship between the real and thoughts as its representation can be looser than their complete mixture or fusion, the world of the fictional real that Nietzsche's philosophy designs becomes itself a really important subject for discussion. The problem of vitality has the same structure, but I think concerns life and thought that are forced to imprison each other and to compose a unitary movement of force. The eternal return as the being of becoming replaces teleology with the self-affirmative movements of life and thoughts that promise to be endlessly open. In Nietzsche's philosophy, Deleuze states, quote, life would be the active force of thought, but thought would be the affirmative power of life. On the one hand, the imperative of becoming, as well as the eternal cycle of affirmation, imposes the endless activeness of life as thought and renders it impossible to think about forceless, weak life or real life without the active force of thought. On the other hand, thought, liberated from nihilism by its self-overcoming, is always subordinated to affirmation, creation, and vitality. The problem of vitality in Nietzsche calls into question this coupling or fusion of life and thought that engenders the ultimate detour for avoiding the encounter with the real of life and restricts the horizon of thought by suggesting the dismissal of the suspicion, doubts, negation, and the passion for the real. Despite the common inclination towards indicating the affinity between Cioran and Nietzsche, Cioran's disagreement with Nietzsche cannot be overlooked. And it is not absurd to imagine that Cioran was aware of the exclusion of the real of life by Nietzscheanism, considering his criticism of it as, quote, the cult of vitality. Vitality is a symptom of a life, and Nietzsche's philosophy of life is his lie to himself. Such an idea seems to constitute Cioran's withdrawal from the frenetic world of the fictional real. According to Cioran, disbelief in Nietzsche is inevitable because of old age or old age and maturity. One of his accounts on Nietzsche is the following. We had believed with Nietzsche in the perpetuity of trances. Thanks to the maturity of our cynicism, we have ventured further than he. The notion of the Superman, Ubermensch, now strikes us as no more than a lucuration. It used to seem as precise as given of experience, thus the enchanter of our youth fades. As Regier, for example, explicates, Cioran did not only describe his declining enthusiasm for Nietzsche as a youthful passion, but also repudiated the Nietzscheanization of French philosophy in the 1960s. What needs to be emphasized here is Cioran's disagreement with the hypostasization of the feverish world of the fictional real. For him, Nietzsche remains to be a naive nihilist who fights against his own life outside the symbolic universe rather than a resident of his own world of thought. In an interview with Jason Weiss, Cioran maintains that Nietzsche is exactly the opposite of everything he claimed. While he acknowledges that Nietzsche's thoughts trigger the age of the obsession with becoming, possibility, and difference, he seems to suggest that we should read Nietzsche's weak life outside his works as an allegory, some sort of allegory. Nietzsche's conversion of his will to health into a philosophy of life is the tragic story of a self-loathing nihilist that hides its true meaning, the persistence of doubt, denial, and negation behind the Dionysian transmutation of the negative into affirmation. These reactions against Nietzscheanism suggest that Cioran's nihilism either goes further than Nietzsche by rejecting the self-overcoming of nihilism, or remains incompletely Nietzschean. In either way, as Sontag rightly states, what's missing in Cioran's work is anything parallel to Nietzsche's heroic effort to surmount nihilism, the doctrine of eternal recurrence. By resuscitating doubt and nihilism, Cioran seems to insist that thoughts needs to be liberated from the role of the motor of vitality and affirmation. Then another temptation that Cioran resists is the reification of death. Death stays in the domain of fiction, thoughts, and the unreal. In other words, death as a concept does not necessarily resist our interpretation of it. For him, it is life, I quote, it is life which is the great unknown. Unlike Schopenhauer and Freud, who assign a specific meaning to death as the aim of life, Cioran recognizes the irrationality and insignificance of reifying death and are being obsessed with it. There is no doubt that both death and suicide are, of course, leitmotifs in Cioran's writings, but disregarding his reluctance towards reifying death can lead to another misunderstanding of his order of thought. His apathy towards death is voiced when he deals with birth as an insoluble subject matter. One of his major interests, especially in The Trouble with Being Born, is the ineluctability of birth. Cioran problematizes it as the following. We are reluctant, of course, to treat birth as a scourge. Has it not been inculcated as the sovereign good? Have we not been told that the worst came at the end, not at the outset of our lives? Yet evil, the real evil, is behind, not ahead of us. This stigmatization of birth in Cioran's writings can be associated with the religious notion of the fall. Criesto, for instance, writes that in Cioran's soteriological world, we are always already fallen and always already unable to be redeemed, and this space of the real and unalterable is the world in which we operate. In our context, what is equally crucial is the displacement of the life-death diet by the birth-stillbirth, or life-non-life, or Genesis diet. While the former presupposes birth as the unchangeable beginning of life and death, the latter deconstructs the very fatedness of birth and of having been born that affects or coincides with the desire for stillbirth, i.e., not having been born. One of the well-known aphorisms of Cioran refers to this desire. He says, I long to be free, desperately free, free as the stillborn are free. He seems to diagnose the real of life as the source of the faded unfreedom from life and the struggle that cannot be otherwise since birth. His diagnosis of the real of life is neither an invitation to a particular meaning or value of life, nor an unchaining of life in itself from the peremptory norms of representational thinking. It is rather an expression of this paradoxical demur to life in itself as the victim and the culprit of itself. So how do we relate stillbirth or the stillborn to the void? Both stillbirth and the void refer to a particular end without a beginning. According to Cioran, the void is nothingness, stripped of its negative qualifications, and the desire for the void is the pursuit of the absence of pursuit. Cioran also knows that stillbirth never. This irresolvable character cannot be confused with impossibility. impossibility of what, for instance, Derrida discusses as aporias. On the one hand, Derrida's aporias, introduced by certain concepts such as death, the gift, and hospitality, cannot be dissociated from one of his major interests, i.e., the destabilization of the authority of the present and of the representation of the present. These aporias are unpresentable as such in relation to time and space. On the other hand, the void designates the impossible freedom from what is real. In terms of stillbirth, an immanent life does not know stillbirth as such, and stillbirth as an end without a beginning cannot be experienced as such. This is not because of the disrupted authority of the present, but by its other, but because of the unpreventability of birth. Put differently, this is not because the name is available too early or too late, but because stillbirth is the name of the absence of the fundamental condition or cause of birth and desire. The desire for stillbirth is self-destructive, self-devouring, not only at the level of possibility, as to whether it can be attained as part of our reality, but also at the level of the fate of having been born. Stillbirth, in a sense, has a reality of its own. This desire continues forever to be unfulfilled. The stillborn, in a sense, skips both life and death, and neither comes nor comes back. Then, is the void real? Or is the void the real? This is a difficult question. For Cioran, the void is backward infinity and the reversed dream in which we sink ourselves. If the real is the undestroyable thing and the source of everything in our life, would the void be its therapeutic other, or is it something still that is actually part of the real world? Cioran, for example, writes, "The void, infinite impasse, longs to set limits to itself, and it is out of hunger for boundaries that it flings itself upon the first pain to appear, upon any sensation likely to wrest it from the pangs of the indefinite." This is because pain, circumscribed and hostile to the vague, is always charged with a meaning, even a negative one, whereas the void is too vast to be able to contain any at all. The void somehow touches the domain of the real, sense, and experience that is prerequisite for the world of thought, fiction, meaning, the multiple, and the worldization in general. At the same time, it remains unreal because of its infinitude. While both the real and the void are susceptible to, and indeed resistant to, being represented, the void is seemingly at risk of being me-ontologized, i.e., being conflated with non-being compared to the ontologization or representation of the real. But what is the relationship between the real and the void? Cioran describes the void as that which makes life and death less tormenting, but it is unattainable and unknown. In this sense, the void can be a Pharmakon for the real. The relationship between the two, of course, requires further studies, but Cioran, I suppose, can be a crucial piece of this puzzle. Thank you for listening.
It's a pleasure to hear you, Kaneta. And I love this topic too. And I didn't see yet any lecture about Cioran, but I love to listen about this, about the existentialism philosophy. It is a pleasure to hear you. Now I will open for the questions for everybody's here. If you want to ask something for Kaneta, let's do the questions now. You can write in the chat or talk to him alive.
Or we can talk later.
Oh, now Paola is talking. It is much better to let the questions for the end of this roundtable, right?
Yeah,
Yes, it's a good
I agree.
advice, Paola. Thank you. And
Yeah.
now will you follow this roundtable with the next one? It is the next one is Monize. Moniz is one friend of mine. We did some semester together, the last one, and it is a pleasure to hear you about your theme because in the last semester I talked a lot now, and it is your turn. Okay, Moniz will say about the human dignity of the second sex, a look from Simone de Beauvoir. Now it is your turn, Monize.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Aparecida. Thank you. I would like to say good morning to everyone here. So the title, Aparecida already said, The Human Dignity of the Second Sex, a look from Simone de Beauvoir. First of all, I want to say that what I bring to present here is part of my master research, being the issues I address to look for a possible solution. So this is not about resolving the issues at this point, but about sharing the idea of my research that is still in progress. So Simone de Beauvoir, in her work, The Second Sex, brings a review concerning the history of philosophy from her existentialist perspective, with the crossing of gender issues. Therefore, she inaugurates the gender debate on philosophy from the point of view of a woman. Her concepts regarding dignity and freedom about subjectivity of woman has possibilitated to draw a parallel to observe the place of woman into the family concept presented in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and where she can be considered worthy, as well as the concepts shown by Beauvoir, such as its role in our society. Such concepts are essential to understanding if the human rights and the principle of the human dignity have effectively taken from granted of gender equality, of broad dignity and freedom to human being the second sex, and consequently to verify the answers proposed by Beauvoir. In this scenario, she exhibits her hesitation on bringing more light concerning the woman issues, as a book since feminism has been intensely debated on last years. Moreover, several misguided ideas regarding questions as is there a real problem? What does it consist of? Will there be a woman? Were presented. The confusion and the theory of the eternal feminine bring perspectives similar to woman is getting lost, besides questions concerning her existence and place on society's shoes. The debate and comprehension of the second sex and his place in society has allowed to draw a parallel to the principle of human dignity presented by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations on the second sex. Therefore, it was possible to point out whether UN interventions and the philosophy of human rights are able to offer a consistent, ideal, useful as base for a democratic and fair society concerning the plurality of genders. So let's start by looking at what the UN says in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Published in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims in its preamble its faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human being, in the equal rights of man and woman. At this moment, in the post-war scenario, the United Nations raised a discourse for gender and rights equality that, among some controversies, embraces a universal perspective of the previously existing individual, the European man. Such declaration consolidates the well-known principle of human dignity, which law studies imports from Kant, and one of the pillars of fundamental human rights, which starts to be studied and debated for its duality in relation to the individual. However, the problem is already stated in the first sentence of this preamble. In its first considerations, opening the whole scope of equal rights and the recognition of dignity starting from the family. It brings, then, equality of rights as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, not for the individual, the human person per se, but for them as a member of a family nucleus. The questions are, what do law and human rights consider to be family? What is the role and place of women in the family from 48 until today? Those considerations keep the dignified woman in the place of wife and of mother. The problem here must come to the surface for debate and clarification, since rights are not inherent to the human being, but are placed as a gift to those who fulfill the previously imposed social role. It is necessary to understand the human being as an autonomous individual with self-determination, and the human being as a quality of living being capable of dialogue. It is also necessary to understand the philosophical basis that forms the background for the UN discourse and which human beings, which individuals have actually benefited from it. In the course of time, we can also highlight the role that the United Nations played in promoting women's rights, directly impacting in the politicals of the international feminist movements resisting, also against the globalization in the 70s. The feminist movement was bringing a powerful transformation in that years, gaining a challenging force in gender equality relations and also destabilizing the patriarchal structure, demanding social change. The UN plays itself as an ally to the feminist movement and subverts its unsystemic character into a movement capable to legitimize neoliberalism. Through the feminist currents that equated women's emancipation and freedom with equal opportunities within the already existing economic system. This comes along with the crisis of capitalism in the 70s. From this moment on, the feminist movement is no longer massive, but individualized and selected. Women enter the labor market and start to be exploited by men beyond domestic service. On these issues, I would have to deepen UN actions, and we don't have time today. But about this, I recommend the works of philosopher and writer Silvia Federici. The concept of dignity can be summarized by the idea that man is always an end in himself, never a means. In his moral works, Kant tries to associate with it with the idea that man has dignity by existing as a rational being with conditions to exercise the autonomy of the will. This concept is taken up again in law studies and also receives a political connotation capable of legitimizing the state of law. Kant presents the right of humanity as an innate right, having freedom as a concept, which, as an innate right, differs from the acquired right, meaning that it belongs to every human being even before entering the state of law. In this way, dignity originates in freedom, and it is a state social duty to preserve it, because it does not originate in the state, but before it belongs to each human person. From the studies of Simone de Beauvoir, especially in the second sex, of the subjectivity of the female gender and the concept of freedom, we can see that the historical and social construction of the family has never given women any of these considerations. On the contrary, pretending to recognize dignity and freedom within this family institute subverts every struggle of emancipation and equality. To characterize and specify the female gender as a member of the family does not presuppose freedom, but servitude. In view of the concept of human dignity, there is a contradiction here. In this way, human rights cease to be universal and inherent to every human person and become gendered. There is no freedom for the person in the position of servitude, and if dignity is conceptualized by freedom, it is not materialized either. There is no equality between individuals of the two genders, except subtractly. As far as concrete existence is concerned, it is very different to exist as a female individual and to exist being someone of the male gender. Simone de Beauvoir published her work, The Second Sex, in 1949, the year after the proclamation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In this work, mainly, Simone was able to bring in her writings a collection of evidence showing that women had never been contemplated by many of the fundamental rights which govern human beings of the male gender. According to Beauvoir, by the fact that she possesses nothing, woman is not elevated to the dignity of a person. She herself is part of the patrimony of man, first of her father and then of her husband. The Second Sex is her best known work and is based on the experience of women in society. The author puts existentialism into her writing, inaugurating in this line of thought a woman's view of a woman, which until then was the object of male analysis. Differentiation, the experience between being a woman and being a man in the world. She shows for the woman the concreteness of existential conditions, such as the oppressions that have made her a second sex. Beauvoir also traces from her philosophical line and the feminist movements a possible way for the emancipation of this oppressed being. The meaning of this effort is given by problematizing the human person and his existence. And this existence. From the existentialist philosophical viewpoint of the author, who makes an enormous contribution to the history of philosophy, including the feminist movements, we can highlight the relationship of freedom and the problem of existence. The feminine being has always been a great universe for men to debate, and in this way, women have been related to themselves based on a judgmental look that influence the construction of their own subjectivity. There is, in this way, the possibility of discussing the subjectivity of woman under Simone's philosophical existentialism and the foundation of freedom as being equality of rights, so that the dignity of the human person is inherent to all human beings. So that's all.
Now, it was a pleasure to hear you, Moniz. I learned with you a lot, and I'd love to make so many questions, but I will jump in this time because I want to invite you to drink a tea or coffee together and explanation those Simone de Beauvoir's idea. And I love this topic, right? Now I will open for no. I won't open for any questions now. It is the only the end. Now I want to ask for the next one to talk, right? And in this moment, it is Sebastian's time. Be welcome, and Sebastian. And Sebastian will talk about seeking new methodologies for trans studies. He is from University of St. Andrews, Reino Unido.
Hi. So yeah, my title is quite a bit of a broad topic. It's been quite hard to pin my thesis down. However, one of the things I'm going to start off then is just talking about the biggest challenges when trying to tackle trans studies. Because one of the biggest challenges for researchers in this area is navigating terminology that is constantly in motion and constantly being contested. Anyone who has come across with online trans discourse will have noticed that ideological context can radically change the meaning of seemingly basic words without even leaving trans-centered forums. And that's not even getting into mainstream talk and variation there. Part of the problem is historical, as some of the terminology have a psychiatric and therefore pathologizing origin many resist. Others have even begun as insults, which some have reclaimed fiercely whilst others still abhor them. So hermeneutical uncertainty and semiotic dilemmas have created total chaos in this conversation, making communication highly difficult, particularly for outsiders unused to the context and malleability of these words. However, this remains the only language we have, and we must be mindful to the flexible use these terms have in ordinary speech by the very people to whom these terms refer to. The purpose of my work is providing a philosophical account for the experiences of dysphoric trans individuals whose pursuit of gender recognition and medical transition seems incoherent, sometimes for very different reasons and sometimes for very similar reasons, to both traditional queer theory and scientific realism. There are a number of special difficulties when attempting to grapple with transsexualism, ranging from the current and historical political climate all the way to the dizzyingly intimate nature of the subject, which makes it doubly difficult to set aside our prior philosophical commitments and engage with the subject impartially. The relentless systematic oppression of trans people throughout history and into present times has made the study of this subject a great taboo. The famous picture of Nazi book burning is actually a picture of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin library being burnt in 1933. This is an archival loss that set back trans research and understanding in unrecoverable ways. The research since has more often than not been distorted by the same sort of prejudices that burnt Hirschfeld's library in the first place. Alongside this is the increasingly violent climate for trans people worldwide that has made even allies a target for hatred, encouraging widespread disengagement and trepidation with the subject. Few areas of academic research inspire a populace to burn an effigy of an academic, as happened to Judith Butler in 2017. As philosophers, we cannot re-enter the classroom as a tabula rasa. We are all constantly unlearning the habits and prejudices inherited from an epistemic canon produced in tandem with systems of oppression. So, the most prevalent answer to what sex and gender are is a variation of sex is biological or a natural kind, and its categories are male, female, or intersex, while gender is a social construct or kind, and its primary categories are man, woman, or non-binary. Let's not complicate this matrix further for now, because two questions immediately come to mind. What gives rise to them, and are they harmful? The first question is etiological. It seeks to clarify the nature of the concepts by providing an explanation of origins. The second question opens the door for moral considerations by focusing on the consequences of the concepts as a means to judge their nature. It is, in effect, a teleological line of inquiry. We elucidate through the consideration of the end results, but in doing so, move beyond explaining and start judging. In other words, the first approach claims to be purely descriptive, whilst the second necessarily has prescriptive considerations in mind. These two approaches should be understood as two different conversations happening on different levels of analysis of the same concept pair. Public debate around sex-gender tends to gravitate towards etiological discussions. Even when everyone agrees that sex is biological and gender is social, how they arise is sharply in contention, and a slight variation in answer will see you in agreement with radically different groups. For example, a misogynist is likely to say that they believe in the sex-gender distinction. It's just that sex, being an objective, biological, and natural kind, determines the status of gender. If men dominate, it is because nature made males more domineering and females more submissive. Some feminists seek to oppose such positions through an invocation of feminine power originating in the female body that makes women different but equal to men. Taking this to its logical extreme, some feminists conclude that trans people are not the gender they identify as because only nature can determine sex, and sex determines gendered experience. Therefore, trans women will always be males and trans men will always be females because neither can escape the biological origin of their assigned gender at birth. The trans-positive accounts can also take a biologically essentialist position by claiming that gender is determined by X biological feature. The appeals tend to be neurological, chromosomal, or related to hormonal exposures in the womb, but needn't be. So instead of appealing to traditional primary and secondary sexual characteristics as causal originators, trans-positive accounts can engage in a slightly more complex etiological argument. They begin by claiming that the existence of trans people, along with their gender claims, are a natural anomaly that is universal to all cultures and time periods. Such a pattern demands an objective answer of origin that must be physiobiological in nature. In the face of inconclusive results so far, those in this camp assure us that it is just a matter of time and funding for the scientific method to demystify the phenomena and uncover the real determinant biological feature that results in sex-gender incongruence. An etiological approach to grappling with the sex-gender distinction lends itself to essentialist theorizing because at the heart of essentialism is a deep respect for scientific causal determinism that promises a complete and sufficient explanation for the origin of all objective phenomena. I do not doubt it's possible for scientists one day to provide such an answer, but that is a matter for scientists to contend with. Even if tomorrow the exact biological origin for sex-gender incongruence was uncovered, that would not tell us what to do with the information. That is the purview of the humanities. To discover a cause is not to discover a solution, and to propose a solution, we must know what problem we are trying to remedy. When the time comes that a colleague in the sciences can point finger to test result, it is my hope that philosophy has anticipated a good enough explanation for what this should mean for trans people and the corresponding duties society has towards them in a way that doesn't end in genocide, as has been the case for most of history. Furthermore, regardless of the particular biological culprit for the sex-gender incongruence, the fact remains that experiencing an incongruence can drastically reduce a person's quality of life to the point of being deemed unlivable. Therefore, to ethically engage with the subject, we must always begin from this telos. To deny the physical need of an objective physiognomy to match a subjective consciousness comes with repercussions paid in blood. Camus famously argued that the most important question in philosophy is whether or not to kill yourself. The evidence is quite clear in the bloody statistics that make up the trans community. To struggle with gender is to struggle with something so foundational, the very question over whether to live or die is in contention. The question of gender is therefore one of the deepest philosophical questions one could contend with. In a practical sense, though, gender functions as an epistemic solution that allows us to avoid large amounts of processing by relying on the wisdom of a heritage that has slowly evolved out of a collective experience of human embodiment. To do as your gender does is to connect yourself ritually with the choices made by those whose embodiment you identify with, voluntarily and involuntarily. But gender can quickly become tyrannical in our decision-making. Gender is our Pandora's box, unleashing the pleasures of sexuality and the horrors of sexism. It can isolate us completely or connect us infinitely. Through gender, we love and link with, but through gender, we also lose chunks of ourselves for the sake of collective legibility. Gender is worthy of terror and worship, love and loathing, embracement and rejection. We give into it daily and resist just as much. But even a life lived in opposition is still a life lived in a synchronized mirroring. What I propose then is to approach gender as abject and sublime. The framing of gender through the abject and sublime creates the opportunity to re-engage with the question of sex-gender incongruence through a conceptual field that is already equipped to refer to multiple levels of non-abstraction simultaneously. By this, I mean that the aesthetics of the abject and the sublime are just as much an integral component of the concepts as the subjective experience of existential awe itself. The abject and the sublime are simultaneously ineffable experience and objects in a museum, for example. Gender therefore functions ontologically much like the abject and sublime, whilst also being an aesthetic modality through which the abject and sublime can be expressed. This approach to gender demands us to be honest about just how much aesthetics plays a part in the Leviathan of gender. Because in many ways, gender is also all the things we've imagined it being. It is a wedding dress, a kilt, a yarmulke. It is flat chests, breasts, the phallus. It is in our voices as much as our words. It is in everything we have ever done to honor or discipline our bodies, from caloric goals to shavings. That is why experiencing sex-gender incongruence can be so distressing. It causes mistaken identifications and associations in almost every aspect of a person's life. In this litany of incorrect relations, the subject experiencing sex-gender incongruence also misses out on the correct ones. One of the great losses most trans people mourn is the missed opportunity to have participated in the milestone traditions of their gender. Trans melancholy is rooted in being excluded from direct participation in the cultured world. This understanding of gender can explain why the severity and trigger causes of dysphoria are so varied. Different cultural norms cause people to be understood in different ways, which logically entails that people will care in different ways and to different degrees about the status of their legibility at any given moment. Trans experiences reveal how vulnerable we are to each other's associations. They are open doors to information we may or may not want the other to have, or which may be simply incorrect. So this is part of what makes transitioning so fascinating to me, and why I characterize transitioning as a heuristic, and because of the non-static nature of dysphoria. No one has been able to provide a sufficient and necessary account of how transitioning works to effectively relieve the sometimes severe mental distress caused by dysphoria in a way that conversion therapy has never been able to deliver. We know that physically and socially transitioning works because it is capable of fully relieving dysphoria. The stark difference in mental states between pre- and post-transition people is proof, but not explanation, that gender interacts with our material being in an essential way. It is also proof that our choices have massive implications for the meaning of our being. If two people were suffering from dysphoria and one chooses to act on it and the other one doesn't, they might be suffering from the same kind of malady, but their gender and sex have the potential of meaning radically different things. For example, the all too common case of an individual suffering from dysphoria but vowing to never speak or act on it for very good reasons. They continue their life using their assigned at birth pronouns, names, titles, and roles, and their body looks, functions, and is purposely presented as any other member of their assigned sex. I find it problematic to insist that they are not their assigned gender at birth, because ultimately the presence or absence of dysphoria pertains to the domain of our facticity, but how we choose to respond to that facticity is what generates meaning. What I wish to propose with this is that choice plays an essential role in truth construction. Yes, a pre-op dysphoric trans man is in many senses a man, but not in all of them. Discerning the impact our choices have in the truth of our identities is essential for progressing transsexual social justice whilst being mindful of feminist liberation. What's particularly interesting to consider in regards to this is the limitations of choice. If freedom is what we do with what's been done to us, then our facticity and creativity mark the limits of our freedom. This freedom may well still be radical as Sartre once dreamt, but some infinities are smaller than others. By this I mean it is important to spell out the differences between choices made or projects abandoned in bad faith and choices unrealized due to systematic oppression. There is a delicate balance here, and it's my belief that the case of transsexuality is among the best for measuring how much we control over the meaning of our lives, versus the control society has on imposing meaning upon us. Calling gender a social construct has no bearing on its reality, just as calling money a social construct will not magically exempt you from having to pay your taxes. Acknowledging that gender is a social construct is merely an acknowledgement that we are social animals and cultural products, the body being the ultimate cultural product. Nonetheless, life must be lived. So my solution for moving forward is through a re-evaluation of the scope of trans and cis as necessary either-or categories we are bound to forever. Once the transition is complete and dysphoria is relieved, there is strong ground to disengage with the trans prefix entirely. it is useful to differentiate between pre-op, non-op trans people and their cis counterparts for a wide range of reasons, such as personal safety, sexual satisfaction, and/or medical needs. But once a person's body is fully aligned with their gender, the distinction does more harm than good. To put simply, it is of no practical use after a certain stage, even in medical context, except to make unnecessary divisions between comrades. In turn, cis has the potential to be reimagined as a term to talk about privilege in the way Sally Haslanger intended gender to be understood. I reach these conclusions based on the argument that when the primary purpose of physical transition is fulfilled, your gender changes ontologically, contra most major accounts of gender. The argument begins with the proposal that the primary purpose of physical transitioning is to cure dysphoria. So by physical transition, I mean the medical interventions which are used to alter sex characteristics. These encompass three main types of medical interventions: hormone therapy, surgical interventions, and other non-surgical interventions. The purpose of physical transition is to align one's body with one's internal map of one's body. When one's body does not align with one's internal map, that means there is an incongruence between one's natal sex characteristics and one's congruent sex characteristics. In other words, one has dysphoria. Therefore, the primary purpose of physically transitioning is to cure dysphoria. Through a phenomenological analysis of people's experiences with dysphoria, I then propose that dysphoria plays such a central role in the lived experience of gender that one's degree of dysphoria and/or euphoria is essential to a sense of oneself as a given gender. Dysphoria is when present sex characteristics do not match an internal target of one's congruent sex characteristics, and I define them as having three related elements. The first is a marked incongruence between one's experience or anticipated sex characteristics and one's natal characteristics. The second is a strong desire to be rid of at least one of one's natal sex characteristics. And the third is a strong desire for sex characteristics one does not possess, congruent with one's gender. In particular, I use dysphoria to only mean the incongruence between an internal target and one's present sex characteristics, and not the distress of other negative affects that are usually associated with dysphoria. I define dysphoria this way to make it clear that whatever its benefits, a pill which removed the negative affect but left the incongruence between the sex characteristics would not constitute a cure for dysphoria in the way that physical transition does. In turn, by euphoria, I mean the absence of dysphoria, the absence of an incongruence between one's present sex characteristics and one's internal target. This could either be because one's actual sex characteristics match that internal target, or because one does not have an internal map at all. So similarly to dysphoria, euphoria can be precisely stated with three components, which mirror the previous ones I just talked about. So the first one is an absence of incongruence, the second is no desire to be rid of any sex characteristics, and the third is no desire for alternate sex characteristics. And as with dysphoria, I use euphoria to only mean the absence of incongruence between an internal target and one's present sex characteristics, and not the affect usually associated with euphoria, such as joy or indifference. In my use of euphoria, I'm using the EU prefix in the Greek sense of well. To be well is to be free or recovered from illness. For example, many cis people are gender euphoric because they have always experienced no incongruence between their present sex characteristics and their internal target sex characteristics, so they are well with regards to their gender. By contrast, many trans people go from experiencing an incongruence such that it impacts their daily life in many critical areas. However, post-transition, because their characteristics match their internal map, they become well and recover with regards to their gender. Although I don't have too much time to go into it now, both cis and trans people can experience dysphoria and euphoria at various times in their lives. So it's in everyone's interest to have that sex characteristic correspond to their internal map. Then from this, I move to argue that the presence or absence of dysphoria is a modifier on a base gender category that produces different genders, such as a dysman or a euman. By one's base gender category, I mean the category which does not require a relation between that category or anything else. Think man, woman, non-binary. Modifiers on base gender categories involve a relation between something other than one's base gender category and the category. So think trans or cis. These are prefixes that modify the actual noun. So while not all modifiers result in different genders, the cis-trans modifiers are commonly treated and understood to result in different genders. For example, take the cases where women, regardless of sexuality, are either keen to date or are encouraged to date trans men as a pointed alternative to cis men based on the assumption that they are inherently different or a less problematic category of man. This is encouraged by those trans people who consider the trans modifier as carving out a different category of gender. So for a modifier to result in a different gender, the modifier must play a sufficiently ubiquitous and important role in our experience of gender. And with all the evidence I have come across, the euphoria-dysphoria spectrum plays a much more ubiquitous and important role in one's experience of gender than the cis-trans modifiers. For many, cis and trans are just shallow labels that have been stuck upon them. However, whether one is euphoric or dysphoric about their body will radically alter your daily experience. In short, identifying whether one is a dis man or a you woman is critically important for understanding the kind of gender one is. So now, if we return to my previous proposition that the primary purpose of transitioning is the removal of dysphoria, then it follows that when that transition is complete and one has gone from a dis man to a you man, there has been a change in one's gender, namely a change on the dysphoric to euphoric spectrum, resulting in a different gender category. The shift on emphasis from the trans-cis distinction to the EU-dis distinction emphasizes that our experiences of gender are not as divided as they seem. The cis man with gynecomastia suffers just as much as the trans man with breasts. Both are dysphoric and both share an internal map that is incongruent with their present sex characteristics. Shifting from trans-cis dichotomies to the EU-dis spectrum highlights a fundamental fact of life that is almost always forgotten. Trans people are humans too. Their behavior is human behavior. Their bodies are human bodies. And the choices they make in response to the options offered by their context are just like anyone else's. Acknowledging the existence of trans people means acknowledging the sex-gender incongruence phenomena. Once you assume that this phenomena exists, it becomes self-evident that there are factors that determine a person's gender in relation to their body that are outside of their control, regardless of whether you're cis or trans. A robust and ethical trans theory should be able to give clear guidelines to distinguish what aspects of sex and gender are within human control to ameliorate and what is beyond our willpower. This is to the benefit of all, because we are all gendered, meaning we all have a stake in the concepts and their fate. If we cannot account for gender euphoria and dysphoria, then we cannot make sense of either gender or sex, because we would have a fundamentally incomplete understanding of what they are and how they relate. Nothing could be more alarming than to have a distorted understanding of an element of personhood that colors almost every aspect of our existence. Such a philosophical error is extremely dangerous both for individuals and societies. Thank you very much.
Now, our presentation, and I want to invite this moment to talk to you and to share this moment with everybody here, because we are in the degrees from the politicals time here in Brazil, and you were talking about the human choice, the new gender, and here in Brazil it's not too easy to do this transformation or to make the choice, because here it's a trouble now, because fundamentalism is very strong here, and the countries share, and it's not too easy to live here, and the people defend this point here in Brazil, like you, like me, Moniz, we are passing hard times. And it's good to hear you about this same, because it's not too easy to find the people to talk about those topics here in Brazil, right? And thank you your presentation. In the end, in this roundtable, I want to talk more about those things. And now I want to ask for let me see who is the next. Is Lewis Williams, and he will talk about nihilism. Now, let me see here, because, guys, let me see. I need to find your... okay. What is moral nihilism? He is from Oxford University, and he will do the last presentation for us. Welcome, Lewis Williams.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So this paper that I'm going to be presenting now is entitled Recalibrating Moral Nihilism. So maybe a good place to start, as was just on the next slide there, is let's ask, well, what is moral nihilism in the first place? Well, unfortunately, the problems begin from step one. Well, it turns out it's really difficult to define what moral nihilism is. The problem is that the term is used in different ways at different times by different authors in the literature. You might think, if you want to get to the bottom of what the term actually is, moral nihilism, if the literature isn't telling us much because it's used in all these different ways, well, maybe let's check out an encyclopedia. So the quotes I've got here are from Richard Joyce's entry in the International Encyclopedia of Ethics on moral nihilism. And even here, he describes moral nihilism as indeterminate, not a well-defined term, pregnant with vague associations. And he goes on to conclude that it would perhaps be safer simply to drop the term nihilism until it's made more precise. Well, doing that is kind of what I want to do in this project, is what I do in this paper. The main aim of this paper is to present an account of moral nihilism that is both A, philosophically interesting, and B, worthy of retention in philosophical discourse. In order to get there, there are three sub-aims that are going to break this talk down into three different sections. The first of which is to distinguish between three often conflated between definitions of moral nihilism that are often found in the literature. We'll proceed in section 2 to look at what my preferred account is, an underexplored account of moral nihilism, and see how it's this account that actually underpins a set of contemporary ethical debates. And the third sub-aim will be to argue that my preferred and underexplored account of moral nihilism best befits the locution moral nihilism, and this is what we should talk about as moral nihilism going forward. So to begin with the first of these sub-aims then, to distinguish between three often conflated between definitions of moral nihilism found in the literature. So the first one of these, Richard Joyce actually says he thinks this is the one that's most commonly found in the literature. This is a definition of moral nihilism that is equivalent with the moral error theory. So what is the moral error theory? Well, the moral error theory has, I think, two components. The first of which is a commitment to cognitivism. This is the view that moral judgments are assertoric. They express truth-apt assertions. They aim to describe the world as it really is. But the error theorist says these moral judgments systematically fail to state truths. They systematically fail to describe the way that the world really is, presumably because, there are no such things as moral properties, or there are no such things as moral values or moral reasons. So we can define what I call nihilism error, this first definition of nihilism, which is synonymous with the error theory, as the view that moral judgments are assertoric, but they fail to state truths. Okay, that's the first definition we find in the literature. The second, I actually think that this, I find this more frequently in the literature, but I'm sure Joyce has read much more of it than I have, so I will agree with that. Perhaps the error theory definition is more frequently found, but regardless, this second definition we can define quite simply is the view that there are no moral facts, and here I've listed just a few references as to where moral nihilism is defined as this view in the literature. Just to dig a little bit deeper into what we mean by there are no moral facts, I think the authors who define moral nihilism in this way, they're talking about inflated rather than deflated moral facts. So they're nihilism facts, the view that there are no moral facts, what this is actually saying is there are no inflated moral facts, by which I mean moral judgments do not correspond with the way that the world really is. That's what nihilism fact is saying. There are no inflated moral facts. No moral judgments actually correspond with the way that the world really is. So how do we then distinguish between those first two definitions of nihilism? They may sound similar on the surface, but there's actually quite a big difference in scope here. primarily being that you can be a nihilist facts. You can deny that there are any inflated moral facts while rejecting cognitivism. And as we've seen, the nihilist error, the error theorist, necessarily endorses cognitivism. So how can you deny that there are inflated moral facts while rejecting cognitivism? Well, you can be a non-cognitivist. The non-cognitivist denies that there are inflated moral facts. They deny that any moral judgment really corresponds with the way that the world really is, because moral judgments aren't in the business of describing the world the way the world really is. All they're in the business of doing is expressing non-cognitive attitudes such as those of approval and disapproval. So though these two views are often equivocated, one, nihilism facts, encompasses non-cognitivism, a category within which many philosophers fall, while nihilism error, the view that's equivalent with the error theory, does not encompass non-cognitivism, because you are necessarily a cognitivist if you're an error theorist. Okay, so those are the first two definitions. Those are the two you'll find most frequently in the literature. But there is also a third view that you will find, well, I attribute it to Sinnott Armstrong, and besides Sinnott Armstrong, I think Guy Kahane may be just about the only other person who has defined moral nihilism in this way. We can define this third version of moral nihilism as follows. Nothing is morally wrong, required, good, bad, and so on, where and so on covers all moral concepts. Now, what's interesting about this definition of moral nihilism is it builds in no claims about moral facts, no claims about the nature of moral judgments or the true factness of moral judgments. This definition is purely first order and substantive. It makes the first order substantive claim that nothing is morally wrong, nothing is morally right, etc. Makes no claims about whether or not moral facts exist, whether or not any moral judgments are true or false. So to distinguish this third view then from the first two, well, first of all, this third view, the underexplored view that I've just presented, which I call nihilism reject, this is distinct from nihilism facts, the view that there are no inflated moral facts, again, by appealing to non-cognitivists. So we've seen that non-cognitivism qualifies as a kind of nihilism fact because non-cognitivists deny that there are any inflated moral facts. But what non-cognitivists typically do is they judge certain actions to be right, certain actions to be wrong. They make positive first-order substantive moral judgments, and in doing so, they think that they're expressing non-cognitive attitudes. In virtue of making these positive first-order moral judgments, non-cognitivists do not qualify as nihilists reject, but again, as we've seen, they can qualify as nihilists facts. So this points towards, again, a fairly substantial difference between these two views. And then finally, we can also distinguish between nihilism reject, the substantive view that nothing is morally right, wrong, etc., from nihilism error, the error theory. And we can do this again by appealing to this cognitivism, non-cognitivism distinction, but in a slightly different way. So you can be a nihilist reject. You can endorse the view that nothing is morally right, wrong, etc., without necessarily being a cognitivist. But you don't need to be a non-cognitivist either, because remember, nihilism reject is purely substantive. It's first order. It makes no metaethical judgments. You can arrive at the nihilist reject view that nothing is morally right, wrong, etc., on purely substantive grounds. And how might you do so? Well, here's a quick example here on the slide. Here's a quick example. So some people in the literature talk about something called cosmic insignificance, right? The view that we are tiny in such a huge universe and nothing that we can do will ever make a difference to anything of note. Now, it's not difficult. You may think it's not valid, but you may also ruminate on that view and arrive at something like the view that nothing matters. You may further ruminate on that view and arrive at the view that nothing matters morally. And maybe this might lead us to a judgment that nothing is morally right, wrong, etc. Maybe this kind of rumination might lead us to nihilism reject. But arriving at nihilism reject, arriving at the view that nothing is right, wrong, etc., on these kinds of substantive grounds does not require endorsing cognitivism, nor does it require endorsing non-cognitivism. Frankly, we don't need to discriminate between cognitivism and non-cognitivism to be a nihilist reject. As we've seen, however, you do have to endorse cognitivism to be an error theorist. So this gestures towards a difference between these two views. Okay, so that I think ties up section 1. I hope what I've shown here is that these three views do actually differ in scope in fairly significant ways that capture fairly significant chunks of ethicists who may fall into one category but not the other. So what we're going to do now is look a little bit deeper at this third underexplored view of moral nihilism, the view that nothing is morally right, wrong, etc., this purely substantive view. And what I want to do now is show that it's actually this version of moral nihilism that underpins a set of contemporary ethical debates that pertain to the implications of moral nihilism. So the primary one of these questions that I'm going to be looking at, this is a very well-trodden question in the recent literature, is something called the what next question. What this question asks is, well, how should we continue to employ moral discourse? This question is traditionally associated with the error theory. It traditionally asks, how should we continue to employ moral discourse if the error theory is true? And certain answers to this question include abolitionism, the view that we should get rid of moral discourse altogether if moral discourse is error-ridden. The fictionalist might argue that we should retain moral discourse, but we should retain it as a useful fiction rather than as something that is seeking to attain truth. Well, why is the what next question associated with the error theory in particular? Because you don't need to be an error theorist to engage with the what next question. I mean, as I say here on this slide, there have been recent investigations into the what next question that have been written by realists and non-cognitivists as well. I mean, you can be a realist and still want to argue that actually maybe moral discourse in its current form isn't actually promoting value, isn't performing the kinds of functions we want it to perform. But nevertheless, the what next question is typically associated with the moral error theory in the literature. And my diagnosis for why this is the case is follows. The error theorist can, in virtue of holding that all moral judgments are untrue, can only answer the what next question by appealing to non-moral considerations. So here are three different examples of how moral error theorists try to answer the what next question. Francois Jacquet, he describes the error theoretic what next question as prudential. We can only give prudential reasons in support of our answer. We can't give moral reasons. Lutz says that we can give only instrumental answers to the question, and Richard Joyce says that the error theoretic what next question issues practical oughts rather than moral oughts. This, of course, separates the error theoretic what next question from versions of the what next question posed by the likes of realists who are able to give moral reasons and moral justifications for their solution. But, I argue, given the way that we have calibrated to the scope of these three different kinds of moral nihilism, I think it's actually nihilism reject, the view that nothing is morally right, wrong, etc., that actually underpins this framing of the what next question. And the reason for this is nihilism reject most precisely delineates the pool of ethicists who are unable to deploy moral justifications. And here's why I say that. If we compare nihilism reject to the error theory, we've seen that nihilism reject, unlike the error theory, encompasses this pool of nihilists who are agnostic about cognitivism and non-cognitivism, this pool of nihilists who arrive at nihilism on purely first-order grounds. But they still, these nihilists, reject all moral judgments. They still say that nothing is morally right or wrong, so they still cannot answer the what next question on moral grounds. These nihilists are only encompassed by nihilism reject. They are not encompassed by nihilism error. And in virtue of the fact that they can't answer the what next question on moral grounds, it seems then that nihilism reject actually encompasses a wider pool of ethicists who, like the error theorist, can't answer the what next question on moral grounds. And next, to briefly turn to nihilism facts, the view that there are no moral facts. Nihilism reject doesn't encompass these non-cognitivists who we've spoken about earlier. Non-cognitivists who do judge certain actions to be right and certain actions to be wrong, and who therefore can, in fact, forge moral answers to the what next question. So if nihilism reject, unlike nihilism facts, excludes these non-cognitivists who can give moral answers to the question, and if it, unlike the error theory, actually does encompass these substantive nihilists who also cannot answer the what next question on moral grounds, and if the distinctive feature of the error theoretic what next question is that it can only be answered on non-moral grounds, then it seems that the what next question for error theorists, it can perhaps more interestingly be framed more generally as the what next question for nihilists reject, for those who make the substantive claim that nothing is morally right, wrong, etc. And actually, sorry, before we turn to this final section, I just want to point out, I think this argument that I've just given generalizes to basically all questions that pertain to the implications of moral nihilism, because for any other question that pertains to the implications of moral nihilism, whether it perhaps asks what the content of moral discourse should be, or more generally, how we should live our lives, again, nihilism reject most precisely delineates this pool of ethicists who cannot deploy moral justifications, and for whom these questions are transformed into something interestingly different, into questions that can only be answered on non-moral grounds. Okay, so enough on that point, enough on showing that nihilism reject is actually underpins, I think, one of the more interesting framings of questions that look into the implications of moral nihilism. Now to turn to the final section to give my positive argument as to why nihilism reject, a substantive view that says that nothing is morally right or wrong, best befits the locution moral nihilism, and why it's this view that we should continue to refer to as moral nihilism. Well, first of all, you might ask, why should we give the locution moral nihilism to only one of these three views? Why not just call all of these three views different kinds of moral nihilism? Well, the reason I think we shouldn't do this is that when we conflate these three kinds of moral nihilism, which we've seen are importantly distinct, we do two things. We A, obfuscate analyses into the plausibility of moral nihilism, and we B, obfuscate analyses into the implications of moral nihilism. Now, in this second section just there, we've seen how conflating these three definitions of nihilism can obfuscate analyses into the implications of moral nihilism. Because which definition of moral nihilism we're running with, well, it can determine our methodology to answering such questions as the what next question. I mean, can we employ moral reasons, for example? Yes, if we're non-cognitivist nihilist facts, but no, if we're a nihilist reject. Consequently, which version of moral nihilism we're running with can determine our answers to the what next question. I mean, if moral reasons speak in favor of one option and non-moral reasons speak in favor of another option, then different definitions of moral nihilism may favor different responses to the what next question. And finally, which definition we're running with can also determine the pool of ethical and meta-ethical theories to which our arguments apply. For example, our arguments will only apply to the non-cognitivist if we are defining moral nihilism as the view that there are no inflated moral facts. But also conflating these kinds of moral nihilism can obfuscate analyses into the plausibility of moral nihilism. I mean, given the distinctions between the three views, you will find large number of ethicists and meta-ethicists who will fall under one category, one definition of moral nihilism, but not under another. An example, of course, is the non-cognitivist. A non-cognitivist may agree that moral nihilism is true if we define moral nihilism as the view that there are no inflated moral facts, but they won't think that moral nihilism is true if we define it in any of the other two ways. So I think it's important that we distinguish between these three kinds of moral nihilism as to A, be clear about what the implications of moral nihilism are, and B, to be clear about whether or not moral nihilism is true. So how should we refer to these three kinds of moral nihilism going forward? Well, with regards to nihilism error, the kind of moral nihilism that's synonymous with the error theory, my suggestion is that we just call this the error theory. And why? Well, because it already has a locution, the error theory. Awarding it the second locution, moral nihilism, I think would just serve to obfuscate further, given that these other two definitions of moral nihilism don't have their own locution like the error theory. So let's compare these other two views then. Nihilism reject, the substantive view that that nothing is morally right or wrong, or nihilism facts, the view that there are no inflated moral facts. Which of these should we refer to as moral nihilism? Well, I'm going to present two brief reasons for thinking that it should be nihilism reject that we define as moral nihilism. Firstly, as I hope to show in section 2 of this presentation, I think nihilism reject is simply a more interesting view with more interesting applications. As I've shown, it's nihilism reject that underpins particularly interesting framings of questions that pertain to the implications of moral nihilism. It more precisely delineates this pool of ethicists who can't employ moral justifications. I think it's a nice unified view in virtue of that, and one that deserves as recognized locutions moral nihilism. But secondly, when we compare nihilism reject with nihilism facts, it seems that nihilism reject, the view that nothing is morally right or wrong, better embodies the spirit of the word nihilism. I mean, as I write here, nihilism embodies a certain kind of destructive force. It derives as a word from the Latin nihil, meaning nothing, and where it first came into, I think, common parlance was in a novel written by Ivan Turgenev, who has a nihilistic character, Bazarov, who doubts everything, rejects everything, and is often the spirit of negation, he writes. And this spirit of negation associated with nihilism, you find this in different kinds of nihilism besides moral nihilism. So you've got existential nihilism, the view that life has no meaning. You've got epistemological nihilism, the view that there is no knowledge, and mereological nihilism, the view that there are no composite objects. Each of these kinds of nihilism really embodies this spirit of negation. Nihilism facts, by contrast, the view that there are no inflated moral facts. This view, as we've seen, it encompasses the non-cognitivist who wholeheartedly judges certain actions to be right and certain actions to be wrong. And this doesn't seem to embody the spirit of negation with which the word nihilism is imbued. Whereas nihilism reject the substantive view that nothing is morally right or wrong. This does seem to exhibit the spirit of negation, and it applies it to all moral judgments by rejecting every moral judgment, by saying, no, nothing is right, nothing is wrong, in a way that I think best befits the term nihilism. So to round up then, the three sub-aims of this paper and of this presentation, I hope to have shown that these three definitions of moral nihilism that we often find in the literature, they are actually importantly distinct. Secondly, I hope to have shown that this group of contemporary questions that pertain to the implications of moral nihilism, I think are most interestingly explored in a particularly unified fashion when explored from the perspective of nihilism reject. And then thirdly, and finally, I hope to have argued that nihilism reject best befits the locution moral nihilism. And so nihilism reject, this view that nothing is morally right, wrong, good, bad, etc., is a clear and robust account of moral nihilism that, contra Richard Joyce, in his entry into the International Encyclopedia of Ethics, hopefully is a philosophically interesting theory and is worthy of retention in philosophical discourse, and is how we should proceed to refer to moral nihilism as a theory. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. And now I will ask for the people to make questions for all the students is here in the search. The people can write or to open the microphone and do the questions. Now, I will say something. Victor La Miranda wrote a messenger, and I will ask for him to open the microphone and do the question to Sebastian, please. If it is possible, of course.
Aparecida, Victor cannot talk to us because he's not here online with us, but I think you can read the question to Sebastian.
Okay, Sebastian. Victor wrote something. He was asking about any reference that logic or epistemology that is possible to help us rethink new methodologies for trans issues. He is curious about this.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about logic. I was never good at logic, so I am tempted to always say that it's not useful for anything, but that's a lie. But in terms of epistemology, definitely, I mean, if you just take concepts such as the epistemic injustice or hermeneutical injustice from epistemology, those are super, super helpful tools that are, yeah, they're very, very helpful ones. And I think, yeah, epistemology, there's so much work to be done in epistemology with regards to gender. And it's a shame that there isn't so much of it. Currently, the emphasis is in ontology, and that's where a lot of the work in gender is coming from. But I definitely think that epistemology has so much to offer. And in terms of your second question of is there a relationship between transphobia and dysphoria? I think the relationship between the two is the fact that transphobia tends to result from the fact that people don't understand dysphoria or euphoria. So that's partly why my definition of euphoria is no incongruence, because a lot of the time people think that you have to feel really great about your gender or etc. And in fact, it's just the privilege of not having to deal with dysphoria that makes you a euphoric individual. But then this becomes an almost epistemic problem again, where it's just like, how can people who have no understanding of an incongruence have any empathy towards those who do? And this is why I think it's very important to have more discussions around this, because if it's already conceptually difficult, because people don't come with the resources to understand this topic, if you then don't have a discussion that includes them and includes their experience of gender, it just becomes an impossible task to get over transphobia. And it is an epistemic problem in many ways. How can a person with no understanding of dysphoria empathize with those who do? So there's lots of work to be done.
Okay, now, thanks your answer those questions, Sebastian. And Lewis Williams wants to do a question too. Now your turn, Lewis.
Thanks. Yeah, my question, Sebastian, I really enjoyed the talk, first of all. My question is, perhaps there was a nuance that I missed, but I feel at times in your talk, I think you referred to, and I feel like you were running with a kind of binary distinction between dysphoria and euphoria in terms of gender. But then at times you referenced the spectrum as well. So yeah, I was just wondering whether you see the two as being binary, or whether being on part of a wider spectrum, or perhaps binary while being on part of that wider spectrum. And depending on the answer you give, whether you think that this plays any particularly important functions in your arguments more generally?
Yes, so that's actually what I'm currently working on at the moment in my chapter section, because it's almost like, I think the best analogy that I can come up with at the moment is thinking of the primary colors. So technically, if you can combine the primary colors and get any other color, and almost an infinite spectrum of colors. But ultimately, at its base, there are three colors, and you're going to have a combination of those three. And it's the same with like sort of dysphoria, euphoria, where you will have a combination of dysphoria and euphoria as a person transitions as they go along. But ultimately, you can get over the benchmark into the euphoric state. So it's useful to be able to separate them and see the two ends between the green and the blue, but always know that there is an infinite spectrum in between that depends highly on the individual. And it's very tricky to talk about that in a way that's not confusing. So
No, thank you. That's helpful.
Now, any questions? We have more, I think 10 minutes. Is it, Monize? Is it right? We have more 10 minutes, I guess.
I have one quick question for Mizuki. Basically, so unfortunately, the UK is not very intercontinental philosophy, which I think is the biggest shame ever. And so my forays into Cioran have been purely from a personal perspective and not a formalized one. And so it was very striking to hear you say something along the lines that Cioran doesn't reify death. And I was hoping you could say a little bit more about what that means, because when I read like the short history of decay and Cioran is inviting you to basically have the courage to offer yourself, it seems that's a bit counterintuitive. So if you could just expand on that, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, I think it's clearly that it's clear that Cioran writes a lot about death and suicide, but at the same time, Cioran is hesitant in terms of thinking about death as something that really like important compared to birth, and he really, think about I think death for Cioran is something really ambiguous and does not really resist our interpretation of it. And we can like put so many like we can talk a lot about death, but at the same time, what is truly mysterious for Cioran is life, and what is really like difficult to overcome by negate this. Like it's difficult to negate his life, while you can say like death is something completely imaginary, like you cannot experience it directly, but life is currently we are experiencing it, and it's therefore it's difficult to really negate it. So compared to like, as I said in the presentation, like it's not that Cioran is not necessarily like really like Cioran is like concerned about death and suicide and wrote about it. But at the same time, the main issue for Cioran is, as I said, birth, that was and that is inevitable for us.
So would you say that like it's almost
yeah, I think it's really counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
But
like,
I think...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what you're saying just makes me think that this is almost in opposition to Heidegger's being towards death, and it seems like Cioran's proposal is like being from life.
Yeah, something like that, I think.
Mm.
But at the same time, being is a complex subject matter for Cioran, I guess, because being is also still in language, and that's why I use the term the real or real life outside the world or outside the domain of the symbolic universe to explicate the Cioran's approach to what is currently going on and what has been going on in your everyday, like in your life. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, Cioran is always a very sensible person.
Yeah, and so and it's also difficult to like Cioran's style of writing is also like difficult to kind of like capture, because he uses a lot of aphorisms and short sentences to express his emotions. So like logically understanding how he thinks is one of the challenges that I'm kind of currently facing.
Very good. Very good. And now, Monize, open your microphone, please.
Yeah.
Thanks. And what do you think? We will have more questions, or would you like to talk with them? What suggestion we can do at this moment? We have a short time. You decide, honey.
Yeah, I don't know. Is any question from anybody? I think in the chat we don't have any more, so...
No. The search answered all the questions they asked between them. And I love this round table. I have so many questions to do for all. And but I don't have any time to do those questions, so we will let for the other time.
Yeah, I would like to say that it was a pleasure to be with you guys, hear from your researches, and it's nice that you bring your researches to share with us. So thank you so much for being here with us. We are so happy that you're here.
Yes, it was a pleasure for me to talk to you.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. So we finishing the last table in the morning, because here Brazil it's not noon yet. It's early. Okay. And guys, it was a pleasure. Thank you for very much one more time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you once again. Bye.
Bye.